Environmental toxins can have an impact on our health. They are tied to increases in asthma and allergies and have been shown to affect both inflammatory and immune-related conditions. Endocrine disrupting chemicals are the most extensively studied in terms of their impact on our health, and these chemicals can do a lot to damage our endocrine and reproductive systems, but they also may affect our immune response, even to the point of causing either immunodeficiency or suppressing your immune response or triggering an overactive response seen in both allergies and autoimmune diseases. So today I am breaking down several common chemicals found in our everyday environment and how they affect the inflammatory process. So before I jump in, I just need to attach a disclaimer to this video that the information in today's talk is not a substitute for the diagnosis, treatment, or care of disease by a medical provider. This is for informational purposes only. So please contact your qualified health professional for any changes to your medical care. Okay, so I'm kicking off the discussion with benzenes. Benzenes are a very common air pollutant and used a lot in industrial chemicals. And they are also a known carcinogen or, known to cause cancer. So benzenes are really well studied on its effect in cancer, but they also do have an inflammatory effect. So this happens when benzene is broken down or metabolized in your body, and the byproducts or the metabolites that they break down to can actually be inflammatory. So there was a really interesting study back in 2007 where researchers found that benzene metabolites, including catechol, hydroquinone, 1,2,4, I'm going to butcher these names, benzatriol, and 1,4-benzoquinone, triggered cytokine release from red blood cells. So if you've watched my videos before, you're familiar with the inflammatory process. Cytokines are these chemical mediators that can either be inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, but the ones that these benzene specifically triggered, or their metabolites triggered, were inflammatory. So IL-6 and IL-8 are two very common inflammatory cytokines. Benzene also has an immunosuppressive effect on the adaptive immune system. So if you remember, your immune system has two different kind of components to it. You have your adaptive immune system, which is your long-lasting immune system that, recognizes viruses and, bacteria and other harmful things that may enter your body, so it can mount a more successful attack on them. After you've been exposed over and over. So benzene actually can suppress the adaptive immune system, which is the long-lasting immune system, and it can activate your innate immune system. So your innate immune system is your non-specific immune system. It's really your first line of defense in terms of battling viruses and diseases. So it's kind of the immediate chronic, inflammatory response. So because it can activate that innate immune system, it can activate an inflammatory response in your body. All right, moving on to bisphenol A, or as we all know more commonly as BPA. So BPA is found in food packaging, it's found in electronics, in paper, in toys even, but we pretty much mostly know BPA in terms of like water bottles and cans, so in canned food. So you'll notice things now are advertised as BPA free because BPA can be pretty harmful. So in terms of inflammation, BPA can actually affect your helper T cells. So your helper T cells are your white blood cells, or they're also called T lymphocytes, and they it can basically kind of skew your response to inflammation. So your T helper cells can be further broken down or specified into something called CD4+. So your CD4+ cells are kind of like, I think of them as like an orchestra conductor. They coordinate your immune response. So they figure out what's going on. They gather other white blood cells like your macrophages and your B cells to kind of come in and get rid of the invader. So your CD4 can be kind of further broken down into different types of helper cells. And two of them are inflammatory. So, can trigger more inflammation. These are your Th1 and your Th17. And then you have your Th2 and your Tregs, or your T regulatory helper cells, which are anti-inflammatory. So BPA has been shown to actually influence whether or not CD4 kind of differentiates into the pro-inflammatory or the anti-inflammatory. The research really isn't clear about, which one it goes to. It can actually do either pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, and it really depends on kind of how much exposure there is to BPA, how long you're exposed to it, and kind of what the timing is. So that's a little bit unclear. But the other thing that is kind of important to remember about BPA it is a known endocrine disruptor, so it can actually affect your hormones. And so when it does that, if you've watched my video about kind of estrogen and its effect on inflammation, especially in autoimmune diseases, it can actually bind to receptors in your body to kind of suppress the endocrine function. So that can also lead to more inflammation. And then the last thing that BPA does is it can antagonize something called peroxisome proliferator activated receptors, or PPAR. So these are proteins that help regulate gene expression, and PPAR play a pretty significant role in the development of inflammatory diseases. So it can kind of trigger those to overreact and potentially cause more inflammation. All right, so moving on to the next one is 4-nonylphenol. So you find this chemical in liquid detergents, in cosmetics, paint, and also in pesticides that they use for agriculture. So 4-nonylphenol, it's a tongue twister, is a known endocrine disruptor. And what it does, it can actually trigger your COX-2 and your PGE2 production. So PGE2 is prostaglandin E2. So to get back a step, so COX-2 is an enzyme, which I've talked about before, but it is responsible for causing inflammation. And then prostaglandin E2 also triggers inflammation by activating your mast cells. And it's also responsible for inducing chronic inflammation and autoimmune diseases. So 4-nonylphenol can actually, contribute to chronic disease, chronic inflammation, and autoimmune diseases. They've actually observed this in lung inflammation and in asthma in mice. So they exposed mice to 4-nonylphenol, and they, kind of saw an increase in lung inflammation. And then there's also another study that suggested that 4-nonylphenol increases pro-inflammatory cytokines in inflammatory bowel disease. So not a very pretty chemical. Okay. Next is something called atrazine. Atrazine is a commonly used pesticide. So it's found in our environment and in contaminated drinking water, or just water in general. And it's also an endocrine disruptor. So one study found that atrazine and its metabolites altered the antioxidant ability of the liver. Remember, the liver is where kind of everything is metabolized and broken down. And a lot of your main antioxidants, such as glutathione, that is in your liver. So if your liver has a reduced antioxidant capacity, that means that there's going to be more free radicals floating around in your body, and just leads to more inflammation. They also found that atrazine affected testosterone production as well, which is, again, another hormone that can play a role in inflammation. Atrazine can also regulate nitric oxide production. So nitric oxide is an important molecule in cancer development, and it may actually suppress the immune response during tumor development. So it could basically, bottom line is, it can lead to cancer. Okay, the last one is a chemical that I've talked about a lot and we hear a lot about these days, but it's called phthalates. and it's very hard to pronounce. But phthalates are, a very common ingredient in, or chemical in, like everything. They are found in everything: cosmetics, cleaning supplies, toys, plastics, anything that kind of is like long lasting, you will find a phthalate in. Phthalates have been shown to trigger inflammation and increase your risk of asthma. And they also, along with being endocrine disruptors, may also be immune disruptors, so disrupting your immune system. So chronic exposure to phthalates have shown to increase white blood cells in lungs, which brings on a more inflammatory effect in your lungs. It can also affect the Th2, so the helper T cells that are more pro-inflammatory. So it can affect that response, and it can also may have immunosuppressive effects depending on exposure. And then it can also disrupt the gene expression, similar to what we found in BPA. So it's a pretty nasty chemical, and you just want to be very careful about using anything with phthalates in it. All right, so just to recap, today we focused on common chemicals that are found in our everyday life that may trigger inflammation. So it's important to be aware of these chemicals, and it's also important to understand, where you find them and how to avoid them. So in my next video, I will be discussing how to reduce your toxic exposure to help, further reduce inflammation. So stay tuned for that video. Thank you for joining me today. If you have not already, click the subscribe button down at the bottom to follow me on YouTube, and tune in for more interesting videos to learn about the connection between autoimmune diseases, inflammation, and diet and lifestyle. Have a great day.